storm. We knew the world so well. We tabulated the number of table legs ever wrought by carpenters and the number of the same sawed and stained by furniture factories. We even knew the number of tears it would take to fill the Pacific Ocean, depending on whether the criers were infants, girls under 10, professional football players, or widows. This is exactly how much you cried when your husband died, we could tell them. This is how many tears fell onto your husband's hand. And this is how many milliseconds the warmth of those tears forestalled the cooling of his skin. Isn't this grand, we said. Doesn't this help you with your grief, Mrs. Nyberg? But she said she didn't want to know. Just shook her head and said she didn't want to know. There were still pills in a plastic cup on the corner of his dinner tray next to the applesauce. The napkin, soiled, crumpled in a little wet ball, seemed like it wanted to soak in all the weight in the world, to draw in her grief and leave her clean. Would you like to know how many of his cells are still alive? But it's no use. She won't listen, even as the nurses enter in and the orderlies, the candy stripers, the doctors, the morticians, all of them absorbed in what must be done, what must be done. Almost no one hears her whisper, she can't, she can't, she can't. And one of my favorite things about East Island is the fact that you can stand on some of the shores and look out over the water and you cannot see a single human light. I've never seen as many stars out there as I have seen elsewhere. And, you know, it's possible to feel like a different type of isolation than I have ever encountered anywhere else in the world, even deep in some mountains. I spent a lot of time sitting on the rocks at night after the rest of the islands seemed to have gone to sleep. And one of the takeaways from that was this poem called Destination. No human light invades this recess in the shoals. Gas station light clouds, bar neon nebula and evening fog, traffic signal reds and yellow suns, the galaxy of skies over elsewheres. Here, the star chart maps my skin in the bluish whites of the pale flesh around the hearts of the fish that pip at whatever flotsam bobs the shore ripples as I watch satellites caress atmosphere. Their light doesn't disturb the air it kisses, does not have feathers or pressing lips to whisper like the tides, but they tell me, you are there, on your back among the low churn of waves withdrawn. The ocean gives by taking away. The sea urchins that congregate on the rocks thrust up needles like hands in supplication, beg the wives, the children, the inspirations, the continuities to stop drifting off by inches, implore the moon to let down her gathered tidal robes and cease her stride towards the cosmos. Don't leave us an empty nest of sky, they say. Don't skim past pulsars and dwarf stars building a shell of ice in search of something to shatter against. All right. This next poem, I'll actually say is one of my absolute favorite poems in the entire collection. I don't know if other people like this one as well, but it's one that really felt like I took a hold of something that I've been trying to get in my writing for a really long time. It was a very precise feeling that I wanted to convey. And to me, it's sort of the quintessence of the evenings I spend out on my porch or my back deck or what have you at night, just trying to sort of understand how I connect to all of the things that surround me. And it's called At the Center of It. Something always keeps things from where they want to be. Copper sheets keep slugs from gardenias, nets the birds from the berries, and the roof bays the rain. In the driveway, a ragged cat sizes up the trash bin, smells the tuna cans, the scraps of salmon, rotting chicken, turkey bones. Every night she sits and licks her chops, combs her whiskers with her paw. Sometimes she hops to the top, scratches the smooth plastic, not realizing that her own weight holds it shut, just as in all things. Lord, how I itch to step forward and take hold of the railing to make something happen. But how I fear that if I do, nothing will. Until then, the smell of cooling soil under wind, through dandelion stalks, rustle of wisteria leaves, the soft click of a streetlight dousing, electric buzz slips from the air like thread from a shirt. The neighbor's dogs don't bark, all for me. All right, so I'm thinking I'm going to read two more poems. Um, this one is written on reflection about just a lot of winter nights, especially those I spent up in New Hampshire, walking by a place called Old Maid's Pond up in Nashua, which was behind my house when I lived up there as a teenager. And I used to love walking there in the snow. It's called Frozen Pond. I've crouched here so long, the snow on the shore lies unbroken. Below, angled cracks in water shelves, layers of frozen dominoes. There is silence and the sound of silent things falling. I trace the memory of ice skates on the surface. Somewhere underneath, the fish. Somewhere, the frogs survive. Deep ice moans and gravel crunches, chafes jagged black edges. I am water too, but it's easy to forget because I call myself by the flotsam suspended in it. Without rocks to break the surface, water lies about its motion by reflecting the frozen pines, the late birds, and all my faces. If the clouds were real, I'd stick my hands into them regardless of how blue my nails got. Fingers can't trace our real edges anyway. We all forget the braille of memory when our hearts began to beat. The fractures grope numb as ice sheets buck slow against each other, as tectonic plates of winter shatter and rise. All right, and this last one is called Bach Crater. I actually developed a pretty heavy interest in astronomy while I worked in a coffee shop, and an old friend of mine named Livia Tornabene wrote his dissertation on planetary science focused on lunar craters in the coffee shop, and we'd have just endless conversations about them. And this poem actually sort of came out years and years later, but it was directly inspired by those talks, and it's called Bach Crater, which is the name of a crater on the far side of the moon. Bach Crater. Once you were impact, a birth swaddled in an ejecta blanket, a 27-kilometer eye open to the solar system's outer reaches. They call your crib the dark side of the moon, but it's simply the side we never see, the one that always looks away. And we look away too from the line between can't and won't, build telescopes and satellites and long frequency scanners to extend gaze towards celestial filaments, because there's simply too many graves to dig, and our hands are made to grasp the shovel and dig, but we've never been the ilk to tilt our nose towards the soil. If our eyes could leave claw marks, the cosmos would bear deep swaths the planets could roll into like marbles as we scrawl column after column in black-bound logbooks our data. Coordinates, telemetries, temperatures, radiographic magnetronic maps, computer renditioning ourselves into the folds of celestial fabric. It's not been long since our imaginations danced with the music of celestial spheres, or since we hyphenated space-time, stuck neat little hands in neat little lab coats, and chuckled softly before lighting our cigars. It was and is time to clean underneath our nails. Our glasses, smudged with sweat salts, have fallen halfway down our noses. It doesn't matter how many of our hands don't hold a shovel. It's only our eyes that look away. While we gaze into the rareness of the blows that form the universe, we don't really know what defines a crater, the bowl or the space that fills it. A hole filled with dirt is still a hole if you remember the edges, the same of our flesh. Thank you. All right, and so I want to turn this over to a phenomenal poet by the name of Jesse Graves. I first met Jesse in, I think I was an undergraduate actually, and he was beginning his PhD, but needless to say, it's been a good 15 years since I first encountered his work. And now I'm amazed to be able to say that he is the author of 4 full collections of poems, including Tennessee Landscape with Blighted Pine, Basin Ghosts, Spectre Mountain, and Merciful Days. And one thing I always carried with me about the work of Jesse Graves was, first off, the profound sense of wisdom, even at his young age, that I found in his words, that he always had a strong and impressive control of his voice, and he was able to render images that never ceased to blow me away. And then he matched that with a generosity of spirit in the classroom as he offered outstanding and insightful critiques to every poem that came across his place. It was actually a true pleasure to work with Jesse through our classes together, and I am absolutely thrilled to be able to hand this reading over to him.
Andrew, thank you so much. Those poems were amazing. What amazing images you have in these poems. I can't wait to read them.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna use the Q&A time afterward to buy Andrew's book and to buy Jeff's new book, which we have links for in the chat. So I'm excited about both of these. Andrew, thank you for that introduction. Wisdom might be overstating it, but I hope that geniality was maybe. Andrew worked in the coolest coffee shop in Knoxville when I knew him way back when, and it was so fun to go in. After being in the library, being in class, I was starting my PhD program at UT, and I get to go in and have my cup of soup or have my coffee, and then I'd still get to talk poetry with Andrew. It was so exciting when he published his first chapbook, which I hope you can find a link to that as well. And to think, wow, here's this young poet just on his way right out the gate, and it's been exciting to see his work come along at UTC and be appearing shortly in this new chapbook. I believe that Andrew painted the cover. Am I right about that? You did the painting on the cover of that? So
yeah, I did.
Yeah, fantastic. Multi-talented artist, Andrew Najberg. Well, thank you for organizing this for us. I'm delighted to be with you and Jeff and all of you nice people here with us. I'm gonna start with a poem that's it's just on paper. It's not in a collection or anything. But I'm going to read it for Andrew. It's an old Knoxville poem, and he might remember a couple of these landmarks that made such an impression on me. It's called In a Familiar City. Cities do not preserve buildings just because you love them, or to help you relive a dream, so you can drink the espresso again on 11th Street that changed your taste forever. So you can watch Ingmar Bergman films flicker through the clacking projector at Terrace Tap House. Or so you can find faded books in the back room above Jackson Avenue Antiques, sitting with your back against the shelves, reading Henry Miller's The Air-Conditioned Nightmare, while a passing train rattled the upstairs shutters, and particles of dust made wavering transit all around you, passing along an index finger of light from higher realms. Through a window clouded with dust, arriving upon this very page. So I lived in Knoxville a couple of times in my life, and I don't live very far from it now, but when I go back there, I think about all these places that I used to go to and all these places that were so formative for me, and none of them are there. Practically all are part of the past. So I'll read a couple of poems from Merciful Days. This is the collection of poems that just came out at the end of last year. And I'll start with one that is about a grandfather of mine and his later years, what I remember of his later years. He was already quite elderly when I was born. So this one's called Old Man Wandering the Roads. My grandfather grafted trees and sold the shoots across 4 counties to farmers who wanted new fruit for canning, an apricot or yellow pear, jar of late autumn to sweeten winter bread. He left a trail of growing things wherever he went and carried a little change in his pockets to prove he had done his day of work. Maybe not a lot of it, but enough to get around, enough to buy gas for an old Ford, Coca-Cola for the road, sardines and saltines for dinner. I remember him as a talker who visited often but never stayed long, sitting shoulders forward on our couch, cradling an empty coffee cup, anxious to tell where he'd been that morning as my father listened with his eyes cast down, trying not to notice the split seams and unlaced shoes. Old man wandering the roads, my mother said, clearing plates and cups once he was gone. And each time my father went outside with him when he left, walked him slowly to his truck, but never came straight back into the house, finding something always to do in the fields, new ground ever to break, a stump to haul away, some old animal dying and needing buried. I'll read a couple of ghost stories. How about that? They're poems, but they're eerie in their own way. I grew up in a pretty spooky place. I grew up in Sharps Chapel, Tennessee. It's about 40 miles north of Knoxville, but it takes you a little over an hour to get there, if that tells you anything about the winding roads that you have to travel, the last part. And we couldn't see our nearest neighbors or any lights. Andrew's poem about being on the island made me think of the holler where I grew up, where you couldn't see. I mean, it's really just the stars. And we finally got a street light when I was about 12. But otherwise, no neighbors, no nothing. So these are a couple of Sharps Chapel poems. First one is called East Running Spring. Some looked into the water and saw nothing, or more rightly said, looked through the water into the mirror at the flame of the candle, and still saw nothing they would admit. My mother would never peek, she claims, but her own mother did, who showed her and me where to find the secret spring among the several that burbled up from the muck of what the first settlers called Bearwaller and Caney Creek. You had to know to dip beneath the slate rot just under the road bank, where the grass parted for a stream of pebbles and silt, and a cold, clear jet running just the opposite direction of the main creek it fed into. My grandmother gazed with all her brothers and sisters. What I see is a casket, the oldest boy, Rubel, said, but I can't tell who's in it. He was dead in a month, 19 years old. Their sister Delta, what she saw was the face of a stranger, and she was married within a year. Her new husband, the picture image of the man she described that night, candles burning on the table like the new moon of March. Another sister, Minnie, saw a blackbird circling, and Clyde made out the curved handle of a cane. Others claimed to see only a blur or a swirl like the wind or the force that makes water flow. The house that my grandmother lived in when I was little, like all the other houses I knew of, was haunted. So here's a poem about that same house that through later remained in the family really until just a year or two ago. My older sister spent a summer there just a few years ago. So this is many years later from the first ghost stories I heard about that house. And she was there for the summer and had a few experiences, but this is one of those. It's called Upper Chambers. The faces watching us aren't always the faces we are watching, or that we know are with us. As in the snapshot on my nephew's phone of my sister sitting on the couch in a house built by our great-grandfather, holding two orange and white cats curled gently asleep, while above them all, in a corner where wall meets ceiling, another face stares straight into the camera, bearded and unsmiling, stranger to us all, keeping solemn watch over the part of our world that also belongs to him. And I think I'll close with just one last poem from Merciful Days. I'll read it for the rainy night that so many of us are having in East Tennessee, and about a night somewhat like this, called Headlights in the Rain. Rain covers the southeast tonight, makes me restless in the late hours, wishing to be in my home country, where plastic flowers are windblown on the gravestones of my people. I can picture headlights on the road between here and there, in bends in the highway where pavement yields to the shape of ridge lines. Headlights in the rain, passing through Lowland and Raven Hill, crossing William Bean Gap and Little Sycamore Creek, Lone Mountain straight as a spindle in the west. My father drove these roads on his way to the terminal in White Pine, his blue and orange roadway truck waiting with its trailer already loaded, his logbook tucked in a travel bag with a change of clothes and some little white pills to keep his eyes open. I want to feel an engine churn tonight, steady as surging blood, alive. So I'll close with that one, and I really appreciate you all being here tonight. It's a delightful crowd, and so many wonderful poets in our midst out there. I'm glad that my reading's over, so I don't have to read in front of so many excellent poets anymore. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Hardin, who is familiar to so many of you. And I think it's fair to say that to know Jeff is to love Jeff. I don't think I'm alone in that. Not only is he possibly the most prolific poet that I know, he's among the most generous and kind-hearted and thoughtful of his fellow travelers on this road. And I think his ancestors have been in Tennessee just about as long as mine. We'll have to count this back at some point, Jeff. I'm going to share just a little bit of his biography with you because I want to mention his accomplishments, which are so extensive and so impressive. Jeff Hardin was born in Savannah, Tennessee, in Hardin County, an 8th generation descendant of the county's founder. He's a graduate of Austin Peay State University and the University of Alabama, where he received his MFA in poetry. He's the author of 3 chapbooks, as well as 6 collections of poetry. I told you he was prolific. These poems, these collections have won awards from Storyline Press and Jacquard Press, Texas Review Press. They've been selected out of what we all know to be enormous stacks of submissions by the likes of Toy Darracott and Mark Jarman. His 7th book, Watermark, is forthcoming in 2022. So hold on to your seats. More than 600 of his poems have appeared in literary journals. You younger poets, write these down because these are the places you're going to want to send your poems, where they will get rejected over and over again. But you want to try these places because they are the best literary journals around. The Southern Review, North American Review, Plowshares, the Hudson Review, personal favorite, and so many more. Southern Poetry Review. I could go on, but let us get on to his poetry. I can't wait to hear it. He's a professor of English at Columbia State Community College in Columbia, Tennessee, and I hope you will make Jeff Hardin feel very welcome.
Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for being here. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces and some faces I haven't seen in a while. Old friends from graduate school who are here tonight as well. Yeah, actually, I had posted something the other day, Jesse, on Facebook about, actually, I shared your video of you reading the poem Cinnamon, which is on YouTube. And I think I made some comment. I was pretty sure that we were really supposed to be next door neighbors and be, brothers for life. But that didn't exactly happen, but I do feel a deep kinship. I'm going to begin with actually not a poem, but just the last lines of a poem in one of my old books, since we're all reading. It's just the last 4 lines of a poem called This Version of Events. I think it's in my book, Small Revolution. In the slow march of history, I side with those who read by lamplight, fingers poised to turn a page, lingering there in the premise-rich quiet between 2 worlds. I do read, or I do write every day. This is either healthy or unhealthy or obsessive. I don't know what it is. Well, I know one time I made a comment about, writing feels like living next to a really vast woods. And every day I get to walk around in the woods, and every day I see something I've never seen before. So if I don't do it, I just kind of feel like, what have I missed? For more than 2 years, I've invited people to follow along on Facebook. I have a total secret group called Hardin Daily. It's just Monday through Friday, so the weekends are off. But I post a brand new poem. So I thought I'd give you guys a sneak peek of tomorrow's poem, which I wrote this morning. I think the title is A Poem as a Foretaste of Timelessness. Like leap ho, I've sung to a field and been scolded by the scent of a flower. Isn't there always a voice calling? And isn't it sometimes mist above a pond? Caught yet again among friends' conversations, I imagine my words, sprung from a source too hidden to find, trickling over stones up a hollow gone dark. Could I, if my heart were more pure, if I silenced my mind to the stillness of aster stems before the day begins, hear all around me Gregorian chants? I'm sure this day and all the days to come are just a foretaste of a timelessness I cannot comprehend. Geese steer the sky toward the last thought Jesus had. Like Issa, I have no shame in speaking to sparrows. What can it mean that I was born a human? Every answer I know soon shifts, evading its question. So that's the poem I wrote this morning. I may tweak it some. This is called Without Ceasing. All day, every day, around the clock, like a prayer vigil, there should be poets writing poems, accounting for milkweed pods and old homesteads abandoned, poets stirring campfire ash, noting just the place along the shoreline the heron cast down, poets in shifts like monks praying grace upon the whole of the earth's vast groanings. What is life but a weeping, a leaping, a gathering of leaves swept up and up into wind? Which moment, mattering more than another, will escape us? Even as no moment matters more than another, since each in its singularity brings into being something that wasn't there before. All day, every day, beginning again and not ceasing, but seeking the words, what the words in their seeking find, what the finding brings forth, what the moments upon moments begin to tell of a story that is never not beginning. So I thought I would read a poem. I don't know, in my mind, this is connected to you, Andrew, because I know we talked about one time you had a poem with the same title, prosopagnosia, which is this neurological condition where people are unable to recognize familiar faces. Some of you may have heard of this before. This is a poem in my book, No Other Kind of World. Prosopagnosia. I know in America, we think ourselves David holding a stone, ready to leap toward the fight. But what if it turns out instead, we're the giant? Too few people have decided to fail, to step to the side so another can stretch toward the finish line. From the swallows, we learn how to swap who will lead. You and I have spent centuries telling our stories, one to another, face to face, in the smallest of rooms. Even Frost, in his sestets, didn't reach clear conclusions. I want the original version, Magritte's still life, or those pair of initials hidden by Leonardo in Mona Lisa's eyes, he thought would never be found. In you, in me, one has to wonder what God has hidden. A weeping for piano notes entwined, or for the moment the goose far behind catches up. And since I think we've all probably been touched by the pandemic and know people who have died, I was reminded of a poem I wrote some years ago called Late September. So I thought I would read this. What we're talking about here is the loss of so many gone away from where we are. You can say to heaven if you believe, but for the time being, they are gone from us. And we go on sitting in the early mornings, counting berries, weighing down crepe myrtle limbs, or watching the sycamore sense its slightest sway. Sometimes, late September, I remember them, my dead, and think that I go out from where I am as one might go down from a porch, and then take 2 steps off the bottom board, as if nearing a sound just barely there. And maybe it matters to have these moments alone, without the ones who mattered most to us. To have the absence wholly present, simply to stand for a time in the being of not being. I'll admit that's hard to comprehend, especially alone, without another voice to help along the kind of understanding that comes when 2 or more are gathered. What we're talking about here is the space between the sounds of the woodpecker's search for what's beneath the bark, the hunger each knows and flings against, over and over, until there's no sound between the lack of sound, and no tree, and no field, and ever and only the sky. And I think I'll read next a poem that will be a little bit of a surprise, I guess, but I see one of my oldest friends here, Mark Burnett, and I wrote a poem in Mark's presence in the year 2000, and it was something he said, kind of as a throwaway statement, I guess, and it just lodged in my mind. And now I don't remember exactly what it was, but anyway, this is a poem called "Moon Came." It's actually in my very first chapbook years ago, and so this is for Mark Burnett. It's good to see you, pal. Moon came. Moon came, and no one punished, no crimes at all. Old women laughed with one another, walking their neighborhood streets. These were hours through which to journey and be alive with all that is alive, all that hears our footsteps coming. Know this, all creation knows we walk among it. As needed, it sends the sun or shade, wind or stillness. And know this too, immense is our exhilaration, our consummation with large and small that come to greet us. For moon came, vast and speechless, abiding grace. All right. Well, I have a chapbook forthcoming, and I'm not even exactly sure where it is. Must be under something here. Yeah, here it is. So yeah, I've got this little chapbook that's coming out. It's called Generosity for a Later Generation. And one of my former students, John Searle, whose photographs have graced the covers of 3 of my books. This is one of his photographs that I've always loved, and so I asked him to use it. I think I'll read a poem out of this and maybe one more. So this is called Studying the Sages. I guess I'm going to ask us, what are you studying? You know, so one of my first teaching jobs years ago was at a historically Black college, and my students would very often say, this is like 1993, and my students would say, Mr. Hardin, I ain't studying that. You know, I ain't studying. It was just this kind of idiom, I guess they said over and over. And I used to make up other things. I'd say, what are you studying? I'd be studying mimosa limbs. Or I'd just make up like the most random thing, you know, like I'd be studying little black catfish when they swim out from under a rock in a creek. You better study that. just to kind of catch them off guard. But anyway, this is called studying the sages. All these years I've studied how the sages found their joy. Now look at me. I'm destitute. They gave me to thirst, which has led me to grace. When I was 8 or 9, I used to lay my head on moss and stare up through mimosa limbs. No wonder my mind wants to drown in blue sky. What to make of myself? For I'm made of these stems and twigs and leaf bits turning to rot, and these roots plunged deep beside a still water. I don't worry too much as long as somewhere a girl opening a notebook begins to sketch bare trees, holding aloft the afternoon's loss of light. One can't predict the water's downhill course, but one can trail along behind the stops and starts and see a tracing out of something deep inside the earth. And I think I'll finish with a poem I've never read, and I don't think it's never been published. So, and I'm not even sure that you've seen this, Jesse, but I'm pretty sure you haven't. It's pretty old. But I've written a lot of poems that have been addressed to specific poets and published these through the years. And I know I wrote one to you. I probably never, I was probably wanting it to get published so it would be a surprise. So it's not a surprise. But anyway, I'll end with this. It's called Concerning the Place We Find Ourselves, to Jesse Graves. It's good to have a people and a place to recognize, a beach back up a hollow, and a dried up branch to get there, stumbling on. It's a comfort to have a story to be part of, to hear it reaching back through centuries, remembering dugout springs and hilltop resting spots, and how a people came to find a curve of earth that spoke to them. Not everybody hears how cane poles near a creek bed tap their slender lengths, or how the water slaps a willow's roots, or how a hollow holds the light a little longer farther in. A time, as anybody knows, is brief, but also, if listened to, dense and intricate, filled with rustlings out of view, and cave walls undisturbed, and crossed and crisscrossed paths crowded in upon, reclaimed. The grass, when greening, glows upon 1,000 hillsides, like prophecies revealed, too many in a single moment to account for, to comprehend. That's the place we find ourselves, the story still unfolding, born from every step we take on ground our presence hallows, led along into a time that does not know our names, nor need the words we find, nor even seem to be there when we reach the place we are. Thank y'all.
So I want to first off thank you all for coming. Thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. And if you do have any questions, we are more than happy to answer. I do ask that people use the chat box. Just type them on in, and we're more than happy to chat about it.
Jeff, I have to say I'm blown away by that poem. I'd never seen that. I wonder if I could just like weep in front of 50 people. I probably shouldn't.
Go for it.
Nothing wrong with that.
Thank you so much.
That was what I was hoping.
That's just a beautiful poem. You have to send me that too. I'm delighted. I'm delighted by that. I'm thrilled. Thank you.
Well, I as I said, when I first began these years ago, like, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, I envisioned the idea that a poem might get published and then the poet see it. But of course, sometimes poems take a long time to get published. So,
Even for Jeff Hardin, everybody,
yeah.
Sometimes poems take a long time to get published.
Oh yeah,
This is why you have to write
I'm
one
on a
every day.
decade delay, as I usually say.
Well, I have a good feeling that poem should be published. So I hope it is someday. Thank you.
I don't know. I think Jeff's running out of journals to put places or put pieces. So. Yeah, one thing that absolutely blew me away was when I just saw a random post from Jeff on Facebook about Jesse Graves. I'd known them both independently. I had no idea that the two of you all were well acquainted, and so when I saw that, I was just like, "That's just fantastic." That was actually a major inspiration for why I thought to invite the two of you together. Was that random post I saw from you, Jeff?
We've known each other a long time, haven't we?
Yeah, a lot of years, and we knew a lot of other people in common.
Yep.
Years before that.
Yeah, even before we met, we had a lot of common
Yeah.
friends, common poets, and so many poets that we love and maybe didn't even know, and we were reading them together at the same time. I've been thinking about this a lot, Jeff, and it ties into your poems to other poets. I've been thinking a lot about the genealogy of each of us as readers, but also as writers, and how we none of us have read the same books or the same poems or any of the same texts in the same order or with the same impact or the same attention. And yet a lot of us have shared reading experiences that we may never know about. We learn about it through opportunities like this and things. It's just one more thing that we have in common with people in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Real quick, I'm going to go ahead and in the chat, I'm going to post another copy of the links to everyone's work. Definitely want to encourage folk to check on out. Out of curiosity, how did the two of you all meet?
Well, actually, I had, I think it was the year 2012. My family and I took like this 12-day vacation up the Shenandoah Valley. And before I left home, I sent an email to Linda Parsons and Marilyn Cowlett. Hey, I'm going to be passing through Knoxville on my vacation on my way to Johnson City, and send me a poem that has been accepted for publication but hasn't yet appeared in print. It'll give me something to read on my vacation. And then that launched me into every place I went to. I was in Johnson City, so I sent Jesse an email, and probably Alan Holmes, and then all along the path, not everybody responded, and sometimes it wasn't even people I knew. I mean, I know Marilyn Cowlett and Linda Parsons very well, but I don't think Jesse and I had actually met at that time, but we both knew of each other, and just that random email on my part, he responded.
Yeah, we might have met in person the next year, maybe. I remember meeting you when I was editing an anthology of Tennessee poets with William Wright. And we were soliciting poems. We found poets in every corner of the state. And I remember we did a reading at the Southern Festival of Books. And is that the first time we met in person, Jeff?
Actually, I think we met at Lincoln Memorial.
Yeah.
At the conference there that Arnault.
Yep.
Mountain Heritage.
You're right. That might have been the first. Yep.
2014.
Yep.
I think.
That's probably it.
Because you and Will did a workshop. I think that was 14.
Yep. Yeah. Sounds right.
That's one of my favorite things about the the world of poetry is sometimes it just feels like it's this really, it's like one gradual conversation that people step into, they step out of, but it's always pulling all of us together. It's been amazing, some of the connections I've encountered between poets and authors that I never would have imagined existed until I learned about them. So, all right, well, does anybody have any questions we can address down below?
No questions, but a joy to see all of you again.
Hey, John.
Thank you.
Same to you, John. Hope you're keeping everything going with the Chattanooga Writers Guild down there. It's a great
Amen.
organization. Why not Nebraska is what I always say.
Hey, Neil.
I've just now gotten a chance to catch up on some of the comments in the chat. I didn't really get to see those as they were coming in, reading and then listening to Jeff, and I really appreciate how thoughtful and encouraging they are, and what close attention y'all were paying to those poems.
Well, here's a fantastic question, actually. What obsessions are you interested in exploring in your new works?
Well, one thing I've been doing for a few years, kind of sporadically, but I realize I probably wrote the first poem of this type maybe 14 years ago, a long time ago. But I had written a poem called "Taking Up the Cause of Affection," and I mean seriously, like probably in 2004. And it took a lot of years, most of a decade, before it was accepted by Poetry Northwest, of all places. And I remember when I got the journal, I just, I was reading everything, but I read my own poem, but it was like reading something by like some person from, from 12 years ago. And I suddenly remembered, oh, I wrote a bunch of titles, like Taking Up the Cause of Contentment, Taking Up the Cause of, Taking Up the, and in recent years, there's been, especially in the public sphere, a lot of language that is something that doesn't really resonate with me. And so I took up that project again, and I started writing about all of these, what I think of as values that that are important. In one of my other books years ago, I'd written this idea about, if I have said as my task the overthrow of a language, just so preposterous. But of course there is a biblical story of where a group moves in, but I think it says something like within 2 years the other group that they moved in among had utterly forgotten their old language, and I just love the implication of that. And so the journal Grist at UT Knoxville just published a couple of these poems, Taking Up the Cause of Gentleness, Taking Up the Cause of Faithfulness, I think is the other one. Anyway, I published a handful of those, but I probably have written 30 or 40 such poems with those similar titles. And I think of them as a kind of protest, like a protest poetry, but it's on behalf of, sacrament, or, whatever the word is. But it's a word that I feel like doesn't get a lot of airplay in our language, and so I want to take up these causes. It may sound silly, but it's one of the kind of obsessions I've had over the last 4 or 5 years.
How about you, Jesse?
Yeah, that's a great answer. I don't think I have anything I don't have anything idealistic, I don't suppose. I've explored a lot of my obsessions pretty thoroughly, and I think it's been an interesting, couple of years of writing for me recently, in looking for maybe the material that didn't present itself to me as a writer first. You know, like I have been thinking a lot about dreams lately and writing the sort of dream world and the dream life, and that sort of semi-conscious, semi-determined experience that is also a little bit outside our control and a little bit outside our understanding, I think, or for me anyway. So I've been doing some dream writing, and that's probably the closest thing to an obsession that I've been writing about or am thinking toward.
Now I've been getting deeper into quantum physics and quantum phenomena myself. It's actually played a pretty central role in shaping the collection. I won't say I have a new collection put together at this point because I'm just putting out my my current collection. But of course, as we've mentioned, things move slow in the poetry world, and so while I've been waiting for the whole process of going to press and all that stuff, really starting back in about April. I just had a pretty significant surge of poems. Part of my pandemic start escapism was to immerse myself in reading scientific literature. I got pretty fixated on, subatomic quantum phenomena. And it's been a pretty central place in the current collection that I'm starting to see take shape. And I have a hunch that's going to be my focus for a good year, I think, in my poems.
As you're talking, Andrea, I'm reminded of how I always have some kind of reference to U2. It's always like ready. But the way in which apparently they get together and they kind of have these jam sessions, and then they observe them later, or they go back and listen to tracks, and then they isolate out of that something that they've never heard before. And that's how they kind of find their way into sometimes a new sound, if somebody thinks they have a new sound. And I feel like that's part of, like, it's maybe not the same thing, but if I write every day, then not everything has to matter. In fact, what was it you said, Jesse, many years ago? You said the poet Donald Justice, I think you said Justice said toward the end of his life that he wished he had written more poems. Not that he had published more poems, that he wished he had written more poems. And so for me, writing poems on a daily basis, I feel like I'm just doing this, and then something else one day shows up, and like, okay, I don't think I've quite done something like this before, or this is a new shape. I remember in the year 2007, I know this because we built our house at that time, and I was reading a new collection of poems by Seamus Heaney, District and Circle, and there was a sonnet about chopping wood. And as soon as I read that sonnet, all of a sudden this whole cache of material that I had never written about before in my own life, I suddenly began writing sonnets. And my third book is a book of sonnets. Well, it won the Donald Justice Prize. But that whole collection almost entirely came out of a 2-month period in which a creek bank that I grew up on and camping and all of this material started unfolding. And I don't think I would have written any of that if I hadn't read that poem by Seamus Heaney. And so maybe our obsessions are already there, and then something just sort of prompts it or sparks it in some way.
I can't agree with you more. One of my absolute favorite poets is a lifelong inspiration for me is Dr. Arthur Smith, the late poet from University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And he was one of my favorite people on the planet. And I developed a really close relationship with him over the years. I would just, even after I stopped being a student at UTK, I'd drop by his office or we'd meet up for coffee and things like that. And one of my favorite things about Art was, I'd sit down with him and immediately he'd be, he would just start talking about things like, have you heard about this new black hole that they discovered? Or, have you heard this song? And, he would toss all kinds of just fantastic stuff my way. And there was always just such a joy in the exploration. And that's something that I always try to seek out as well. That I'll actually say even some of, even though some of my poems I would kind of categorize as extremely difficult to write, at the same time, I find that even those poems, I find a lot of joy in their creation, and that's usually how I know that it's a piece that's going to be worth pursuing for me. I don't know, it's a very odd experience, but yeah, I definitely owe a lot of that to Art Smith because he never ceased just being so thrilled about the act of exploring the world and then converting the world into his poetry. That is one of my favorite books. I have several copies behind me as well. Yep.
I'm in a room of 5,000 poetry collections. In fact, it's funny you mentioned Art, because there was a poem I was going to read that I wrote after he died. I didn't include it in my reading, but I had it with me, or I have it with me. Yeah, I love his poetry, and his whole demeanor.
Absolutely. Yeah, somebody called him their guru in the chat, and
that was me. Yeah.
I mean, I same here. I mean, like literally in conversation, I've always characterized him as one of my absolute favorite people. He's one of those people that knowing him, I thought the world was clearly better for having him in it.
Yeah.
And I know that I'm clearly better for having learned from him as much as I did.
Yeah. I miss him every day. This was his fountain pen.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He for those of you who don't know Art's work, he died at the end of 2018, and somewhat suddenly, somewhat unexpectedly, and I miss him every day. I mean, it really was one of the formative friendships and mentorships of my whole life, and came to think of him as just so much more than like my old teacher, but like this person who sort of shaped kind of person that you want to become, not just writer. But Andrew, you mentioned his love of discovery, and kind of late in his he was probably 60 years old. He got excited about foreign films, and he hadn't been a film student, or he went into it just like, wow, what am I going to watch next? And it was like the enthusiasm and the thrill of discovery that he brought to something that he didn't know much about going into it. He just saw a couple films and loved them, and that became an obsession for him. Since we were talking about obsessions, he built this great library of film, and wrote about in the Fortunate Era. There are at least 2 poems in there that reference these fairly obscure foreign films, and he just became really kind of a self-taught expert about so many things. But that was one that I happened to be there when I was a graduate student to sort of witness him making this discovery. It was so thrilling, really.
Yeah, oh, go ahead, Jeff.
Oh, I was going to say, in 2013, I'd been when my second book was out, I'd been in North Carolina with a bunch of events, but I was coming through Knoxville on a Sunday afternoon, and I timed it because Art was signing his book at the bookstore. And what's the name of the bookstore in
Probably Union Ave.
Yeah, Union Avenue. I timed it so that I could get there right before his reading. Totally, a surprise. And we later gave a reading together at the Southern Festival of Books. For those of you who may or may not know Art, one of the lines in the poem I wrote after he died, it said something like, let's imagine a man who might have turned Cain's heart toward his brother.
Yeah.
And I don't know, there was just a kind of wonderful gentleness about him.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I actually would say that, well, you guys may not know, but I actually started out as a computer science major in college. And I'd written all my life, but I hadn't really had confidence in my own work. And I actually, to fill a general education credit on a whim, I took Art's poetry workshop. And I actually, I kid you not, within less than a month of being in his class, I actually sat down one day in his class, and I literally thought, that is exactly what I want to do. And that's really how I ended up sort of immersing myself in poetry and literature as, as my kind of life work. Yeah, he had I found that, that exact gentleness, that magnanimous spirit that he had, just to be absolutely inspiring. And part of the reason I'm talking about him so much is that this comes back to that question about obsessions, and he's prominently featured in the writing I have been doing. So that was actually, it was about 15, 20 pages of what I've been shaping that directly references my relationship with him later in his life. So. Yeah. All right. Has anybody got any other questions down there? Oh, wait, there's one. So this seems to be initially targeted towards Jeff, asking whether or not these days you find yourself writing more songs than poems.
No, I don't write songs. I have known some songwriters who, being this close to Nashville, who are part of that world. But in fact, I remember one asked me one time, he said, we should write a song together. And I said, dude, I don't know anything about writing a song. I'll take what you have written and I'll look it over, but I don't think I can be part of the process of writing songs.
I like the musical talent. I have the wish that I could do it, but I probably thought I was writing songs when I was writing my first poems in high school. Probably thought I was writing heavy metal songs, like Black Sabbath would have been my, yeah.
No,
Black Sabbath over here and Waylon Jennings over here. In between.
I'm named after Waylon Jennings.
What?
Yeah, my middle name is Waylon.
I never knew that, Jeff.
Yeah, Jeffrey Waylon. I met him one time. I was taking a picture with him, and as the person was fiddling with the camera, I told him, I said, I'm named after you. My middle name is Waylon. You're my dad's favorite singer. I remember he was pretty tall, and he looked down at me with what I thought was a mixture of shock and pity. Like, who would do that to a kid? But in the country music world, a guy, the small church I grew up in my hometown, the pastor's, one of his kids is a songwriter in Nashville, and currently has the #1 song. I mean, he doesn't sing it, but it's one he wrote.
Wow.
And I remember when this kid was born, and it's kind of cool to see those things. Anybody's success is wonderful. Aren't you just kind of like in any realm whatsoever? Aren't you just amazed that just by the fact of creativity? It doesn't make any sense, but people make up stuff all the time, whether it's a song or a poem or a story or an essay or play or whatever. I don't know, creativity, the older I get, creativity, it just simply astounds me. I almost don't want to do anything else. And I don't want anybody else to do anything else. You were going to paint that fence? Why? Well, unless you could do it and it doesn't look like all the other fences, I'll help you. But if it's just work, you know, make it beautiful.
Well, and I love the fact that, you know, while, yeah, you know, there are different levels of skill and creativity and things like that. I mean, our minds just do it. It's not, you know, it's not like we sit down and we're like, okay, this is creative time. I'm going to create. I mean, you know, yeah, we may schedule time to work and things like that. But, you know, when we look at the world around us, I mean, we project ourselves onto things we see. We manipulate the edges of the world around us, you know, to take on the qualities of our emotions at the time. I mean, literally, we constantly shape and change the world around us every single moment. It's part of what we are, I think. And I think it's absolutely fascinating. All right. Any final questions? And actually, I'll answer that other question. I'm like Jesse, where I am not especially musically talented. The only musical niche I've been able to find for myself is I've learned to play the drums while in quarantine. I think I might actually be decent of it, but I'll definitely say, at least for me, it's very removed from the part of me that writes poetry. It's actually been almost calisthenic in my approach to it, where I'm interested in using it as a major form of exercise. And ironically, as a result, I actually have focused on learning metal drumming because it's the most kinetic that I can think of. So it does have the irony, of course, though, that right now, through social distancing, I have no one to play with. All right.
Probably the best way.
Well, John Manoni, I know you have like 17 questions.
I probably did, but I think most of them were answered by your all's brilliant performances. But I did enjoy all of this very much, and
Always a joy to see you, John.
thank you, buddy. It was a joy to see you too.
I'm glad you could make it out. All
Yeah,
of you,
me
actually. I'm glad to
too.
see all of you all here. It's wonderful to have to be able to gather so many people, even if it's a virtual space, in the same place. And yeah, thank you all so much for being here and for being such an outstanding audience.
I second that. It's great to see you all. There's a thing about being in a room with people, but this is also its own kind of room, and all of us from so many different places right now. That's going to be, that's something, some part of this will carry on, I think, because it's important to bring people together across distances like this.
I hope so. I mean, there's been so many authors that I would have loved to have heard read, and it's been impossible out of just simple physical separation. You know, yeah, I can watch videos, but you know, I do think that the live experience of poetry, of writing, is I think there's almost sort of a magic to it that I think creates a unique life in the work.
Mhm.
All right. Any final questions?
Mhm.
Okay.
So I do want to offer a special thanks, of course, to Jeff Hardin and Jesse Graves for joining me tonight. I'm so thrilled to share the space with you, and I was absolutely enraptured by your work tonight.
Yeah, it's good to be with y'all. It's good to see y'all.
I feel the same way, Andrew. Thank you all for sharing that work, and thank you all for being here with us to share it. It's a real joy. Thank you.
We should do it again sometime.
Yeah. Same time next week.
Bye,
All
y'all.
right, y'all have a wonderful night. Be safe, stay healthy, and yeah, just keep enjoying poetry.
See you later, alligator.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.